Greetings! Hegel and the Enlightenment. Okay, what was that song I was singing? Oh yeah. I ain't got money on my mind, money. Hegel and the Enlightenment. 438, paragraph 438. Reason is spirit when the certainty of being, all reality is elevated to the truth, and it is conscious of itself as its own world and of the world as itself. And you thought it was going to be easy. Okay, so spirit is the ethical life of a people, says Hegel, which is a more digestible way of thinking about it. Spirit, or spirit, doing do, remember Monty Python? Spirit is the way we are connected. We are all connected from a historical perspective. That's my take on this. Hegel is, of course, pro-enlightenment, although some people read him as an anti-enlightenment figure, which I don't think is possible, but whatever. This section of the book that starts up at paragraph 541, which is many paragraphs later, is entitled The Struggle of the Enlightenment with Superstition. So remember when I talked about romanticism? Remember these beautiful views that I usually have behind me? Always have behind me. Okay. And I was talking about the German romantics in particular. So it was the one with the beautiful Madeira background with the clouds skimming overhead. I think it was video 19. And inwardness. Remember that thing about inwardness I was talking about? Well, some argue, contrary to what I've just said, that Hegel himself was a bit of a romantic because he was a critic of the Enlightenment like the Romantics. The Romantics, remember, had this emotional view of human experience. Remember the Johnny Ray song? If your sweetheart sends a letter, all the crying and the sobbing and feeling inward and all that stuff, okay? Country music. Okay, so Hegel wasn't taking a trip to Emotion City, okay? And he wasn't saying that there was a problem with too much reason. He wasn't saying that. Okay, so my thinking is that he saw himself as part of the Enlightenment. I think most people, Hegelian people who read it, see it like that. And the Romantics believed that there was a danger in relying on cold human intelligence, which, yeah, who disagrees with that? And they thought that the Enlightenment and pure reason ignored the emotional or religious or spiritual aspect of humanity. Okay, so Hegel sees the drawbacks of pure reason, but he takes a different approach, and he isn't a romantic. So the Hegel scholar and biographer Terry Pinkard, who I've mentioned a few times in the last few videos, he points out that Hegel's take on the Enlightenment was greatly influenced when he did in his biography of Hegel, by the way, this is. He says Hegel, where he grew up, influenced him, as all of us, it influences enormously. But his thinking, if we know a bit more about what was going on when Hegel was writing and where he wrote, we'll get more of an understanding. So he was brought up in the Duchy of Württemberg, which is modern day Stuttgart. I don't know whether Württemberg exists anymore. So the Duke of Württemberg was a fanatical Catholic and an absolutist. Remember, the word of God, I am the boss, you do as you're told. However, his subjects were mostly Protestants and also didn't like absolutism. They were supporters, as Protestants didn't, they were supporters of a constitution. Now remember that an absolute monarch isn't bound by a constitution or anything else apart from he's just put there by God. So in 1770, the good people of Württemberg, the good Protestant people, got him to sign an agreement that limited his absolute powers, and they were no longer absolute. The people of Württemberg won, and I probably don't mean like the unemployed or farmers, but I'm talking about the sort of the burghers, the burghers, the sort of middle class, lower middle class people. They won, and their traditional rights were guaranteed from then onwards against the power of an absolute ruler, and they were protected by a constitution. Hegel's Protestant and progressive family background shaped his views about and against absolutism and against absolutist rulers. And this background gave him a take on universalism from a very interesting perspective. So some 18th century thinkers argued that universalism promised by the Enlightenment, that was compatible with the rule of an enlightened ruler. Classic example, Frederick the Great. Frederick the Great, okay? He's an absolutist ruler. Um, Frederick the Great of Prussia, I should say, absolutist ruler. And he saw himself as a thoughtful, sophisticated, by his standards, hip, edgy ruler who was so down with the kids that he was able to invite the icon of the Enlightenment, Voltaire, to his court where they'd chat shit for days, basically. So Voltaire is, of course, an intellectual giant. I mean, si Dieu n'existait pas, il faudrait l'inventer. If God didn't exist, it'd be necessary to invent him. I mean, he's full of these really interesting, brilliant one-liners or two-liners, okay? So maybe Hegel had that phrase in mind, you know, if God didn't exist, it'd be necessary to invent him, when he wrote this book. Another quotation from Voltaire would perhaps be more apt in describing Putin and the war machine and how people are easily fooled. He says, those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. I like that one. But like most of us, Voltaire had a high opinion of himself and believed his own publicity. So Voltaire called Frederick the Great a philosopher king. In National Socialist Germany, I mean, not if you remember it, but I'll tell you, he was maybe second to Hitler in the historical league table of great Germans, because of his reputation as a military expansionist. Okay, so if I can change this video, I'm going to flash this up, okay? You can't see, but what I'll do is there's like a painting which I might show you if I can edit this video, called the Round Table of King Frederick II. The Round Table, like our King Arthur's Round Table. So the idea of an enlightened, and so he's around this table with a load of like clever dicks, a load of these, you know, if God didn't exist, it'd be necessary. All these dead clever people from all over Europe. That was in his court, okay. So the idea of an enlightened absolutism took root at this time. An enlightened ruler could usher in a period of universal reason, if only he had a court philosopher. So Hegel was clearly opposed to the universalism of the absolute enlightened rulers. He supported the idea of a special or particular Württemberg solution, constitutional limitation to the political and social problems of the late 18th century. Okay, and we could call this particularism, as opposed to the blindly optimistic universalism promised by the enlightened philosophers, and you've got to say, such as Voltaire. Another example of this kind of universalism of the absolute ruler, you know, if only a ruler could follow the rules of reason and logic, the world would be a better place. That's what many of these enlightenment thinkers thought. Just look, he's so great. Or this ruler, I've got these great thoughts in my head, thought the philosophers. If they could just be transplanted into the mind of Frederick or another absolutist ruler, it'll sort it, because reason is universal. And once we obey the universal precepts of reason, game over. Everything's going to be in the gardens rosy, or everything in the view. Look at that. It's going to be like this, perfect day, great view. That's life. So, and they'll tell them these things over dinner. For example, Denis Diderot, another really good example, an Enlightenment figure. So Catherine the Great invited him to Russia. She was so taken by his thinking. And also because she was also presenting, remember, she was presenting as these Enlightenment rulers were. They were presenting a public face, a public image, even at that time, of themselves, of an Enlightenment ruler. And they were using culture as a weapon in the same way as someone like Putin does today. I mean, all rulers kind of do it, but Putin's a really good example, using, Zhezhev, and ballet, and, all of these sorts of cultural icons that people forget. Look, you see, there's a great image, and someone did it on Twitter, which is like this ruined city of Mariupol, and on top of it is superimposed a ballet dancer like that, saying this is what Russian culture is. So all this stuff, we have to understand this culture and stuff like that. It is rooted and has been rooted, if you look at the 18th century, in this kind of like rulers using culture as a weapon to support their own attempts to aggrandize and make themselves bigger and larger. Okay, so moving back to Denis Diderot. Diderot and Catherine got on so well that, and I'm not making this up, he used to slap her on the thighs. And she'd say, "Oh, Denis Diderot, he was slapping me on the thighs tonight." Google it. It's true. Okay. So The philosophers they fell out with the kings and queens, of course. But what's interesting is that some of the great thinkers of the Enlightenment thought or imagined that they could use the power of reason alone to usher in an enlightened society. If they talked to the right people, then they could make their universalistic paradise happen. Actually, there's a good documentary on BBC iPlayer, and that describes how people like Obama and other rulers and Blair, they thought that they could sort of talk to Putin and make him understand and make him one of us. So these ideas are relevant. It's not just this old guy Hegel who's not relevant. These ideas are relevant, and Hegel's, when he was growing up, and the ideas that he was having were opposed to this sort of doing deals with dictators. Okay, so Diderot is also relevant because Hegel in Phenomenology quotes freely from Diderot's Ramus's Nephew, which in part, it's a kind of play or a dialogue, two people, he and him, who are rabbiting away. And it's about the concept of self-interest and utility. And it's a satire about self-interest. Um, Hurrah for wisdom and philosophy, the wisdom of Solomon, to drink good wines, gorge on choice foods, tumble pretty women, sleep on downy beds. Outside of all that, all is vanity. That's from Ramu's Nephew. And it's great in parts, but it's just a bit long to go through. I was reading on the plane, it's like, it's hard going, but there's some great bits in it, okay. So Hegel saw universalism, this type of universalism. Well, hedonism is a form, hedonism, just pleasure. That's a form of enlightenment. That is a form of enlightenment thinking. So Hegel saw universalism as a solution, but he also believed that you could unite the particularism of places like the Württembergs of this world with the universal characteristics of the Enlightenment or the French Revolution. So you didn't have to have one or the other. You could have both. I mean, that's the argument. So what do I mean by the particular and the universal? Okay, so Friedrich Jacobi, who came a bit before Hegel. So Jacobi's importance for us in this story has to do with his criticism of the Enlightenment. And I keep on using the word the Enlightenment. So just a brief definition. What was the Enlightenment? So in the 17th and 18th centuries, an intellectual, scientific, philosophic movement. And it emphasized new ideas. Knowledge is a good thing in itself, and we acquire knowledge through reason. Okay? We judge the success of our projects by the simple principle of utility. That means, crudely, the greatest happiness of the greatest number. So I think there's a Scottish philosopher, called Hutcheson, and I think he's Scottish, and I think that was his phrase. He coined it before, others. So I like that. It's a one sentence, inadequate definition of the Enlightenment, but it's a good one. So I think you'll get my drift. So Jacobi, he attacked the rationalism of the Enlightenment. And he isn't a flat out reactionary, by the way, Jacobi. He's got some very interesting ideas. For example, he said there could be no I without a you, like Glenn Campbell. There's no me without you. And that's a Hegelian idea. Glenn Campbell clearly is a Hegelian. Okay. But Jacobi was a defender of conservative values. And he particularly took issue with Immanuel Kant. And Jacobi was accused of being an enemy of reason because of his belief in faith and emotion. Okay? Jacobi accused the German idealists of opening the door to nihilism. So because reason was a tool for destroying the established order, but once it brought down these traditional forms of human self-expression, such as religion, belief, tradition, what would replace it? So it's a bit like Edmund Burke, who was an English conservative thinker. After the French Revolution, he was dead radical. He supported the American Revolution. When it came to the French Revolution, oh dear me, his solution to the French Revolution was to curl up in a fetal position and scream because he wanted no part of it. But not being a conservative, but the unlimited application of reason destroys, there is an argument, all that is good and beautiful in the world and leaves nothing behind. That's the argument, okay? Traditions and religion can give people something which stops them feeling that they're living in a tumble dryer, or I've used that word before, or it's just like a desert of self-interest. So these things do give life this additional meaning beyond your own primitive desires. And also relying on the arbitrary will of a powerful ruler was for Hegel, that was the definition of unfreedom and dependency. So Germany in Hegel's time was a patchwork of states, and Hegel wanted a single state, universality, but also he allowed for this, as I said, this Württemberg social and political arrangement. And by the way, it wasn't democracy. Württemberg wasn't democracy. It was the great and the good, like the middle classes. But it was on the road. Far from it, but it was on the road. And later on in life, I think the 1830s, was it 1832 he died, Hegel? But the English Reform Act, Hegel was really, really interested in the English Reform Act. And that was about the extension of the vote, and he was in favour of it. So it wasn't like he was, even though he wrote, and it doesn't sound very democratic. I think anyway, it's interesting. Read the stuff on the English Reform Act. But Hegel's thought also, to complicate matters, but also influenced by his friend and our friend Hölderlin or Holderlin. Remember the guy who fancied the 12-year-old bluntly? You know, he got engaged to her. I don't know whether he fancied her, but he got engaged to her, and he was like. Then she died when she was 15. I don't think it was like there was any. It was consummated. It was a oh, let me not dig that particular hole for myself. But anyway, you can Google that one. So Hegel was a Kantian, but Hölderlin persuaded him that Fichte, another German idealist, he'd reveal flaws in Kant's system. Got a mistake. Oh, there's a mistake there. So Hegel's other friend, Schelling, again, you know, they're all mates, aren't they? He pointed out too that there was a problem. And for consciousness to be possible at all, for us to think anything, we have to combine all our various representations and sensations into one unified view of the world. So as I'm talking now, if you look at that, I've got the sea on one side, that's hitting me. I've got this breeze hitting me. I've got an absolute riot of colours and sensations that are assaulting me from all over. My head's popping off in one direction. How can I get that into one kind of like narrative or one perspective? Okay. So to do that, that's the unified worldview. And without this unity, we wouldn't be conscious objects at all. We'd just have a firing of our neurons and a variety of, like a kaleidoscope of experience, not able to express ourselves. Okay. So the unity, this unity, I should say, this single point of view on the world needs outside content. Okay. It needs all this stuff coming in. It needs, you know, the senses. It needs my memory. It needs, you know, the bee that just float past. It needs all of this stuff, this concept, but otherwise it's nothing. It's to make it meaningful. So it's a combination of the two, as Kant was saying. So Kant argued that although we had to assume that the world was made up of laws and atoms and chemical reactions, etc., the world was determined by causes and laws, but we couldn't know this for sure because we could only know the appearance of things and not the things in themselves. So Kant said we had this because we've got the subjective view of the world, and that's a condition of the possibility, as I said, for any experience. So this subjective view is our freedom in action. And there are all of these laws in nature, but at the same time, there's a whole bunch of spontaneous stuff that's going off in my head. Okay, and I know if you've got to go to work, there's not much freedom in work. And I know if I'm driving down the road, there's not much freedom. I'm not saying that there's loads of decisions that we make in the day that we are free about, you know, tea, coffee. Am I going to go on a diet? We'll eat those chips. Am I going to make that pair? Am I going to go for a pint with my mate? Or am I going to read that book? There's loads of these decisions, right, that are the spontaneous part of ourselves. So there are all these laws in nature, but at the same time, this stuff's going off. And from the objective standpoint, we're determined. We're an object. So we're an object. We're just in the world. I've got these atoms, this head, this body, and so on. From the subjective point, from inside my head, I'm free. So even though I can't prove this by relying on the outside stuff, on the laws and the rules of nature, and the rules necessary for thinking about appearances, all of that stuff is determined, but that stuff isn't in my head. And those who criticised Kant saw that this meant that there were simply two contradictory points of view at work. There was the subjective stuff in my head, and there was the objective point of view. And Pinkard says this threatened, as Jacobi had argued, to swallow up the subjective point of view, which was why Jacobi thought that our subjectivity could be vouchsafed, protected, only by denying the validity of the objective. Enlightenment point of view. In order to shore up the idea that we necessarily entertain these two points of view on ourselves, we therefore had to show that our account of nature required an account of ourselves as self-determining subjectivities, and that our transcendental account of ourselves as formal points of view on the world required just that conception of nature. Okay, so Schelling, that was supposed to be a summary, but it's not, right? Schelling appealed to intellectual intuition. The intellectual intuition, what does that mean? Of the absolute, to resolve this freedom versus determinant. So freedom versus determinants. It's a contradiction, isn't it? Stuff on my head, stuff I haven't outside. Schelling said intellectual intuition. That's the solution. Freedom in a predetermined world. Aha, done it. Hegel's solution wasn't that? His was Geist, spirit. So Geist is a social structure. So to have a mind at all means to have other like minds. Yeah, that's his breakthrough. That was his way around, whether it was successful or not, I don't know, but that was his way around uniting the subjective and the objective point of view. We are like others. My subjective point of view depends on my locating myself in a society where my individual values or norms, they're united with those of others. Okay, and to get there is the story of phenomenology. And I'll scroll back, because do you remember master and slave? Two individuals, they confront each other. Before this confrontation, each of them has this outlook that the world is just the way it is. These individuals have a weird combination of a subjective and an objective point of view that they can't separate. They can't see a difference between the objective and the subjective. Okay. When they confront each other, both want recognition from each other that their point of view is absolute. Their point of view is the truth. I am the boss. I am everything. I am the Lord. They both want to be the whole world. I'm going to eat that. I'm in charge here. They both want their view to be the true point of view. One becomes the master and one becomes the slave. That's videos 12 and 13. So here's how Hegel overcomes this split between the subjective and objective. The slave separates his own particular point of view from what he now sees as the master's objective point of view. So in the slave's head, he's thinking, yeah, I've got to do this stuff. And the master's point of view is the objective. That's the determined bit, okay? He's got to do that. These are the rules he's got to follow. His judgment about what's true or good is conditioned by what the master means by good. Otherwise, this is what will happen. Slave, that dinner is awful. Make me another. So he's got to have the objective point of view in his own head. That's the objective, which is I've got to make the master a good dinner. I know where his point of view is. And what's the slave point of view? I better chop these carrots up and make them really nice. So the slave now understands that his judgment doesn't decide whether something is good, and that overwhelmingly only the master's judgment counts. So it's not just me, I will decide what counts. Constantly he's thinking about the other person. That's this unity. That's the clever bit of Hegel. Well, there's a lot of clever stuff, but that's a really clever innovation. So the creation of the roles of master and slave by this initial conflict helped us to understand what Hegel's spirit is, because it explains the origin of our individual judgment within a larger group whole. Hegel was able to explain that there's no reason out there. It's not just this reason that you pick up like an enlightened person. Reason is something that develops socially, and people must position their individual judgments within societal norms, whether it's the master, it's the slave, there's history. We've got to align ourselves. That's what reason is. Reason starts with masters and slaves, and it moves forwards throughout history into other shapes. Phenomenology, that's the description of this process of how reason develops over time, and it's trial and error. Some shapes of consciousness don't cut it, and others arise to deal with new problems. We are individual islands of consciousness. Reason is a changing product of different and developing social situations. We justify ourselves, we reason in the light of changing societal norms. For example, I can believe that I'm a medieval wizard and hold firmly to the values of medieval wizardry, but me being a medieval wizard has to meet the social world out there. I mean, there's got to be like, I mean, there were medieval wizards, but there had to be court, kings, knights, ladies with hats that are shaped like that, and people had to believe in witchcraft. So today there are no medieval wizards. You could believe in it, but you need that validated by social norms. Okay, so the Enlightenment assumes a set of norms that are universal, that are asocial, that are timeless, that are ahistorical. It assumes a non-partisan, value-free kind of reason that's never existed. There's always classes. There's always contending points of view. Okay, so it's got no viewpoint. It's the view from nowhere. So Hegel doesn't criticize the Enlightenment for being too universal, just the opposite. He believed in the universal as part of it. It was a developing process. Hegel thought spirit was social, me and you and everyone else, and how my thoughts could only develop within a social context. So I turned on TV the other day and I saw the Benny Hill show. You know, you know Benny Hill. For those tune in, it's funny. So, but at the top of the show, there's a banner that read, "Warning: This program reflects the standards, language, and attitudes of that time." Benny Hill and Hegel. It says it all. The people who put that in there 30 years ago, it was okay. He was seen as being, it was a dirty old man, but it was like, oh, it's funny, and everyone watched the TV. Yeah, some people criticize him, but it was socially acceptable to do that. So, moving away from Benny Hill, last point. My point is, Enlightenment philosophers, Putin, Ukraine, war, and so on, that people can sell them out. People with, I noticed the people over the war who appear to be, you know, bastions of reason. Look, war is bad. It's bad all the time. It's bad if you're an American. It's bad if you're a Russian. It's bad for everyone. So let's not have war. That point of view, you could repeat that point of view any time in the last, well, from the time that a human being picked up a pointed stick and stabbed another human being. You could use that at any time. However, it's the Holocaust, you're Jewish, and someone wants to murder you and 6 million of your fellow citizens. And taking up guns in the Warsaw Ghetto, taking up arms against them, for example, when, you know, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. And so what do? You can have this ahistorical, asocial, these values. And, you know, it's good to have those kind of these Enlightenment values. They are good. I'm not knocking them. Point is, if someone's going to kill millions of people, then you've got to say, well, wait a minute, where am I placed in history? I can't have that value. I can't believe in Benny. It's as ridiculous, if not more so, than like having this universal view. Benny Hill being permanently acceptable. It's totally wrong to support peace when people are being murdered by dictators. So this, when you see it, this is my point of view, when people are seeing it, it's ahistorical, it's asocial, and in fact, it's siding with dictators. And you know what it is? It's the same as these Enlightenment philosophers. It's the same as people sucking up to Catherine the Great. It's the same as people sucking up to Frederick the Great, sucking up to militarists. And it sounds great. If only people would just be better. Well, they ain't. So we've got to fight for it. And I think that's what the Hegelian, my reading of it anyway, or my take is, you know, you've got to fight for these rights. You've got to fight for it. And it's terrible. But, you know, for the foreseeable future, short term, that means fighting doesn't just mean thinking it in your head. You've got to go out and enact it in the social space and, you know, defend democracy. Okay, good way to end. Apart from me Benny Hill one. Right. Adios, muchachos, from beautiful Tenerife. Adios.